Welcome. Uh, Welcome to our Vermont Sierra Club Community Conversations. I'm Steve Crowley. I'll be hosting, and we have a couple of great speakers tonight talking about managing forests in a carbon challenged world. First, we've got Tim Stout, who's with Northam Forest Management, and he is very busy bringing information about forest carbon to people around Vermont. And we have Ethan Tapper, who is the Chittenden County Forester. And we'll have a lot to learn from both of these folks. The way this will work, first, let me tell you, this is going to be recorded. So if you want to make sure that, if you want to be off screen, then make sure your camera is off. Otherwise, we welcome you to have your camera on and actively participate. Our speakers will be presenting first, probably for a half hour, 40 minutes. And if you have questions during that time, please go ahead and put them in the chat box, and our speakers may catch them along the way, or we may wait until after the presentations, at which time we hope to have a great open discussion. So with that, I'm going to pass it right along to Tim Stout. Welcome, Tim. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you all for joining us. My name is Tim Stout. I run a small educational nonprofit out of Vermont that's focused specifically on bringing the idea of carbon sequestration and storage to landowners. So I have observed many presentations over the last 3 to 4 years on carbon sequestration, and realized, all right, how would I explain this to landowners in terms that that in their busy schedules they have time to grasp. And I figured if I could grasp it, then anyone could grasp it. So it's the presentation will be looking at carbon sequestration, not in its entirety, because we could take at least a couple of hours talking about carbon markets and so forth, but it's really to get a feel for what it means to residents of Vermont and why it's so important. So I'll give a quick overview of carbon sequestration and storage, what's happening with sequestration and storage in Vermont, because there's a ton of interesting stuff that's going on right now. Progress in applying CSS to small landowners, and we've made some good progress there. What's involved in a carbon sequestration project, and then options that are available today and in the near future for landowners to pursue sequestration and storage. So this is my farm down in Shrewsbury, Vermont, and we tend to look at these pictures as, all right, we've got our forest and we've got our wildlife and we've got a riparian zone. There are all these features that we are aware of, but one thing that I don't think a whole lot of people are aware of is that this is one of our natural solutions to climate change. It's not going to solve the problem of climate change, but our forests, of which we've got magnificent forests in the Northeast, those are making a significant impact on removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that would otherwise be accumulating in the atmosphere. It's absorbing that through photosynthesis, storing it in leaves, storing it in limbs, trunks, root structures, and in the soil. So in Vermont, our climate forester, Ali Kasiba, has all the numbers one could need in order to calculate how much carbon is being sequestered and stored in this property. So to me, I look at it and go, all right, how can we maintain that carbon that's currently there So let's have no development or major cuts, harvests. And how can we sequester more carbon? And that's what I'll get into. So that was looking north toward Shrewsbury Mountain. Killington is right behind it. This is looking south, and I'm just transposing these two because you can see a bunch of other features of where carbon is being stored and how we can increase the level of sequestration. So you look at all that green and all that photosynthesis that's occurring, one might ask, well, why don't you just let that all come up into forest? And then we'd have much more sequestration and storage. Well, we would, but we'd be foregoing other benefits of a major field like this, such as habitat for wildlife, diversity, and so forth. So we want to look at everything as to, well, where can we get more sequestration? A wonderful manual on forest carbon, and I think of it often when I make presentations, this forest carbon, and there's a link at the end of my presentation, but is one of the best pieces out there. It's written by Tony D'Amato at UVM and Paul Catanzaro at UMass Amherst. And it's 16 pages long, but makes things very clear to the audience. So if we look at this, please excuse little seal or whatever over on the right-hand corner. That wasn't my idea, but he's kind of cute. Just looking at, what happens with photosynthesis. We're taking in carbon dioxide, we're giving off oxygen, all that carbon dioxide, all that carbon gets absorbed into the tree at a pretty phenomenal rate that depends on the age of the tree. The rate of sequestration depends on the age of the tree and the particular species. So looking forward, there's the issue of, well, what species of trees should we be favoring to get more sequestration? And that's a challenging undertaking for the scientists out there. Looking at this, it's what we call a carbon pool. So that's where all the carbon is going. That's not going into the atmosphere. It's getting absorbed by this forest. When there's a cut, and you can see kind of in the middle where there've been a number of patch cuts, we lost a lot of that carbon there. And I'd like to say that wood was used for purposes that kept it as wood, but I suspect a lot of it was used for pulp and paper. This was about 10 years ago. Other uses where ultimately that carbon that's on the ground today is in the atmosphere now. So we want to be really careful about how much harvesting we do in order to maintain our carbon. A few key points here are we have a carbon pool, and that's where it's all absorbed, but there's also some flux where we're releasing carbon from the forest. And then it gives you a very clear understanding of storage. That's just cumulative over time. So you're accumulating carbon at a fairly high rate. The sequestration is what's happening within a year, say. So how much is being absorbed by the trees, and then it gets stored. So it's important to distinguish between the two because we want to look at both when we consider the significance that forest carbon can have our impacts on the environment. This is a great chart, and I wish I had more time to explain it, but go to the outer circle, the black or white to black circle, and that shows you that, and then in the very middle, it shows the age of the trees. So as you get further on in age, initially those trees absorb, sequester a lot of carbon. And then as they get older, they store a lot of carbon. So we want to balance, or not balance, but we want to focus on both those benefits. So we want to have smaller trees. We want to have age diversity in our forest. And this is something that Ethan will talk about more, but we want trees of all ages so that we're storing a lot of carbon, but we're also sequestering carbon. So there's a fine balance here. And again, this chart is explained very clearly in that brochure that I just showed you. This is a great chart showing how over time you have a highlight. This red line is the sequestration levels, and then this big block you have your carbon storage, but how significant the storage can be over time and why you want to have an old growth. Well, old growth is very controversial what the definition is, but older trees in your forest as well as a mix of younger trees. People often talk about what as a landowner, what does this mean to me? Can I actually pursue carbon sequestration and storage on my land? How do I make it play a larger role in mitigating climate change? And probably many of you have heard about the carbon markets and carbon credits, where you, based on the amount of sequestered and stored carbon, you can determine how many 1 ton of carbon is equal to 1 carbon credit. And you can sell that on the carbon markets in California. It would take me probably half an hour to explain it very clearly here. But that's one avenue that larger landowners can pursue. For the smaller landowners, we can look at, all right, what's going on within our forest? Do we have the diversity? This tree is a perfect example of a ton of storage. Probably half of that tree, or slightly less than half of that tree, is carbon. So it's an enormous amount of carbon stored up in that tree. So you want some of these old guys in your forest. You want to leave your trees on the ground rather than, and again, Ethan will talk about messy is good, where you don't want a clean forest. Ideally, you want as much debris on the ground that's storing carbon as possible. Again, Ethan will talk about what the other benefits are of that messiness. And then you've got cases where this is a blowdown, about a 20-acre blowdown, 25-acre blowdown on our property. That blowdown happened 20 years ago. And you can see how you've got little trees, which are great for sequestration. You've got your older trees, but it's very interesting how slow these trees have been able to take. So a blowdown, yes, we can say, well, in 50 years, it's going to be a beautiful forest. But unfortunately, we don't we don't have 50 years. We have to act quickly. And that's where I think some level of intervention in sequestration and storage is important. So we're monitoring how this is coming up. We may do some level of thinning to see if we can get get taller trees in a shorter period of time. This is a patch cut about 4 acres where the moose and the deer have had a field day, browsing and holding back almost all growth of vegetation there. So we've been working closely with the state and our county forester and consulting forester to say, all right, we need something to grow there. We want it to grow because of the sequestration impacts of it. But how do you deal with 5 acres and a reasonable amount at a reasonable cost? We thought of putting a fence around it, but that's just not a practical solution. So we're looking again at our entire land, and this is why I think drones are so important. While many people hate drones, I think they're really important to get a sense of the lay of the land and looking at your land and saying, all right, with your forester, where else can we capture carbon? And then we have this, which is a riparian zone, which is not as wide as we'd like, but running between the path and the stream. I used to, for years, mow all the fields right up to the stream. Now we're putting in the riparian zones or building up the riparian zones to avoid as much erosion, and to allow more plant life there and therefore more sequestration and storage. Then this is just, I threw this in just for the fun of it. This is my daughter and grandson, Abe, and my son-in-law. And I thought, what's this land going to be like in 50 years when Abe is my age? Am I still going to have that forest? And is he going to have something like I had to enjoy? And what can we do to build it? So we're planning an oak forest for him. And how does that relate to sequestration? Well, as you can imagine, it's more foliage, more trees. And so we're going to be adding to that on an annual basis with 10 more oaks or 8 more oaks a year. So the intent here is, all right, it's fun to have something for Abe to look forward to, but also what's this doing for the carbon capacity or the carbon pool of my land? And that just gives you a sense of what it's like. A big part of what I do with Northam Forest Carbon is the outreach to landowners, to get more of a buzz among landowners so that we can talk about what we can do. We need experts like Ethan and other county foresters and consulting foresters. But what can we do to build carbon? And so we've done a whole bunch of lectures on carbon. We'll have more to come. We recently did a walk at Billings Farm and Woodstock, and one in Shrewsbury at my farm. Sustainable Woodstock has been absolutely wonderful in supporting this effort, as has Vermont Coverts, which is an organization well worth exploring. And just a plug, I love to do walks and lectures. So if people are interested with their groups, by all means, give me a ring. This is an example of one of the recent walks that we had, which was encouraging because it was about twice the size as my last walk. So I think the interests in forest carbon are gradually increasing. I talked earlier about all that's going on in the state, and there's Cold Hollow to Canada, which is a large forest carbon project. There's Burnt Mountain, which is done by VLT, Vermont Land Trust, and the Nature Conservancy. Nature Conservancy has a new project called Glebe Mountain and another one called Burnt Mountain. And then we've got a large project over at Middlebury. I'm probably missing one in there, but there's a lot of activity building in Vermont around this. So at the very end, there are resources. You'll see in many cases that I've referenced YouTube, and it's not because I'm a huge YouTube fan, but if one were to want to have hour-long sessions on the meat, more of the meat behind sequestration and storage, these are some of the best resources I would recommend. Ethan, who will speak next, has a great YouTube channel with loads of videos. So I'd strongly recommend looking at these for more information. The last one is my website, where I've got probably 30 other reports that one can study if one is keenly interested in it. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Tim. That was terrific. Ethan, to you.
Thank you. Yeah, and so I'm just going to zoom through this and try and talk about a lot of really complex stuff in like 20 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have a bunch of time at the end for questions for Tim and myself as well. So we'll hold those till the end, but there will be time for them. All right, so Tim was talked a lot about carbon, also about his personal stewardship story. And one of the really interesting things about the work that I do as a county forester, my primary role is to help the owners of private parcels of forested land. So Vermont's 75% forested, 80% of those parcels are privately owned. So as a community, we have to like figure out how to manage collectively for all of this different stuff and to balance all these different things. And so what I really want to talk about is sort of beyond carbon, how we're managing for climate change in general, sort of as a community, and what that really even means. So bad news, folks, forests are complicated. They're nuanced. They're these complex, dynamic systems, always changing. While we traditionally think of them as like a bunch of trees, you walk in the forest and you see a bunch of trees. They're actually communities of many different species, from trees to plants, fungi, bugs, microorganisms, larger animals that we would call wildlife, and more. These different pieces and parts of forests are interrelated, they're connected, and they produce emergent properties, which are the qualities of complex systems that are greater than the sum of their parts. They are multi-generational, they are messy, they are imperfect, they celebrate death and change. They're beautiful, but they not necessarily in the way that we think about beauty. They don't appeal to our sense of neatness and order. They are expansive over both space and time. Our biggest challenge really in managing forests is understanding them as complete systems, understanding how they work, understanding the ways they support our lives and our quality of life, understanding their intrinsic value, their right to exist, and then turning that understanding into action. And just know that, so when I'm talking about forests, I'm not talking just about a bunch of trees. I'm talking about this entire system, this community that is a forest. So we talk a lot about climate change, which is really important. And forests are sort of simultaneously a climate change solution by sequestering and storing that carbon, and then also very threatened by climate change because it's this sort of existential threat to the way that they work. But more holistically, we often talk about global change. So global change is a combination of climate change plus other human-caused stressors, like the fact that our landscape is incredibly altered by past land clearing and poor management, invasive exotic plants, animals, pests, and pathogens, what we call biological invasions, forest loss, forest conversion into other land use types like agriculture, forest fragmentation by houses and driveways and roads into turning big forest blocks into smaller and smaller pieces, pollution, the fact that we're in the middle of a mass extinction event and we're losing biodiversity at incredible rates, and more. So we have not just climate change, which is itself really complex and scary, but also like all this other stuff, which is compounding the stressors that are affecting forests. And we call all that stuff global change. And so in addition to managing forests for carbon, we also need to manage forests which are adaptive, which can change, which are resilient, which can stay healthy while they change, and are able to cope with these fast-paced environmental changes of the future. And we don't totally know what all of those are or what they're going to look like or how they're going to affect our forests. Now, this is a really, now sort of in the discussion about forest carbon and about forest management in general, really, this is a famous graphic. This is from a 2010 paper by Jared Nunnery and Bill Keaton. Bill Keaton did a talk for the Sierra Club, and the link was posted in the chat. And so what this illustrates is different amounts of carbon sequestered by a forest under different management scenarios. So this is one thing that is just really important to acknowledge about this is here is this red line is the amount of carbon sequestered by a forest if we don't manage it. And that's higher, and this is true. And then we have all these other different management, clear-cut, shelter wood, which is just a different way of managing a forest. ITS stands for individual tree selection. You don't need to know what all these different terms mean. But what you do need to know is that what it's showing is that this study, which is measuring sort of the mass of carbon that can be sequestered in a forest, is taking into account that thing, which is really important, but not necessarily stuff like qualitative variables, right? Such as wildlife habitat, biodiversity, ecological integrity, the importance of climate resilience and adaptability to buffering the forest from large disturbance events which create large releases of carbon and which are more and more common. We expect to be on our landscape in the future. The quantitative and qualitative benefits of local renewable resources, so stuff like wood versus other potential non-local, non-renewable resources. And so one thing that I think about a lot is it's not just about managing for one thing, right? We're not just managing for carbon. We're not just managing for, healthy forests. We're managing for really for a better, more functional world. And that more functional world recognizes that we have to use resources and that our forests have this history, this legacy that we inherited, and that we're managing them into an uncertain future. And we sort of have to carry all those things with us. So here's some of the examples of the effects of just climate change on forests. And those other components of global change also have feedbacks into this. But we expect to have altered natural disturbance regimes. So natural disturbances of increased frequency and increased intensity. Where I live in Richmond, it seems like we only get these incredibly intense bursts of rain. We expect the ranges, the suitable ranges where our species are best suited to, our tree species, to shift. So our tree species that live here now to become increasingly less well suited to our environment and get increasingly stressed out. And just in general, a lot of stress on our trees and on our forest systems from a variety of different factors. So one of the things that we really need to do, both as forest stewards and also in light of our sort of uncertain future, is to change what we're managing our forests for. So traditionally, we were managing forests for stability. So this idea that we're resisting change. We want forests that are able to sort of stubbornly resist change and keep those trees alive at all costs. But what we really want to manage for now is the idea of resilience. So resilience, a resilient forest is a forest which is capable of maintaining its health and natural processes throughout massive stress and change. So this is both important because we know that massive stress and change is here and that more of it is coming, but then also because this is how forests naturally grow and develop. So forests are resilient, and that's actually one of their defining qualities. Having forests that are resilient will mean that it can stay healthy as a complete system, which will mean that it'll be able to mitigate the effects of climate change and to sequester and store carbon into the future. So how do we make forest resilient? The most important thing that we can do for any of these things is to keep forests as forests, to halt the conversion of forests to other land uses, to development. Doesn't mean that no development can occur. It just means that we need to be really smart about how we do it, and that we cluster it, and that we're not constantly fragmenting our forest, intact large forest blocks into smaller and smaller pieces. Reducing stressors, so limiting the amount of stress that forests face, and stressors can be stuff like overbrowsing by overpopulations of white-tailed deer, invasive exotic plants, insects, pests, and pathogens, stuff like that. Reducing vulnerability, so by managing for diverse forests, we buffer our forests against stressors and disturbances and other things that would affect one species of tree or one size or age of tree, allowing that even if we lose something like ash trees, as we're facing with the emerald ash borer right now, that we still have forests that can be diverse and resilient in the future. And provide refuge, so maintaining the maximum level of plant and animal diversity over time. So we want our forests to be resilient. We're recognizing that they're gonna change, that they're supposed to change, that they have to change, and that we want them to be healthy while they change, but we also want them to be adaptive. So what it means is we want forests which are gonna be able to adapt to a wide variety of potential future conditions. And again, we don't totally know what these are gonna be. These are very much uncertain future conditions that we're managing for. So how do we do that? And again, the best way to do that is by managing for diversity, both species diversity, different species of trees, and structural diversity. Also critical is addressing individual threats to biodiversity, like, again, I'm going to say this a million times, invasive exotic plants, invasive exotic insects, pathogens, pests, stuff like overpopulations of deer that are fundamental threats to our biodiversity, and more. So I put this picture in when I did this presentation for Lewis Creek, because they are in the Lewis Creek Association, because they're an organization that thinks about streams. And so I was thinking about the way that we manage our forests with, both carbon in mind and also stuff like resilience in mind as being similar to how we manage our streams. So like in Vermont, many streams have been ditched and straightened. And in order to get them to a place of what we call equilibrium, we need to restore some natural meanders, and it actually makes them more stable over time, and it makes them less likely to erode over time, moving from that straightened ditch channel to a much more meandering channel like this one in this picture. But in order to reach that place where this stream is going to be more stable and cause less erosion, some erosion needs to occur as that stream sort of redefines that channel. And so in some ways, managing for resilience in our forest can be a little bit like this, where we can cut down trees in a way that is making our forest more diverse, more complex, hopefully more resilient, and is releasing a little bit of carbon, but that will actually buffer our forests and make them more resilient and more adaptive, which will allow them to sequester and store carbon into the future. And we can also do that while lifeboating the whole community of species that make up these forests by providing them with this really complex, interesting habitat that maybe they don't have. And so we're not just protecting the trees in our forest from this stress, we're also providing refuge for all of the species that are dependent on our forest, as they similarly are experiencing these stressors associated with global change. So I think about managing for quantity and for quality. So we want to manage forests that are quantitatively sequestering and storing a lot of carbon, but we also want to manage forests which are resilient and which provide excellent habitat for all of our native organisms, which is qualitative. And those two things are sometimes compatible and sometimes they're not. And so as we manage for not just for habitat for one species or just for carbon or just for healthy forests, but for a healthier world, we really need to balance these complex things. Biodiversity is something that I think about a lot because it often gets sort of forgotten about. So it's something that's severely threatened by global change. It's something that I would argue has intrinsic importance. It's not just, biodiversity is the currency of our ecosystems. It's what makes them work, but it's not important just because it does something for us. It's just important because these species are important because they have the right to exist because they exist. But they are also really helpful in our ecosystems and make them work. Protecting biodiversity in a context of global change will include sequestering carbon, but may also require using tools that don't necessarily optimize forest carbon. So like when people are thinking about, why would you ever cut a tree? We might cut a tree to make habitat that's more complex, because we know that, for instance, old growth forests used to cover more than 2/3 of Vermont, and now they cover less than 1% of Vermont. And we can't make old growth forests faster than we can make themselves, but we can provide many of the habitats and the ecological processes associated with old growth forests by using the harvesting of trees or the cutting of trees as a tool. So, which goes into the type of forestry that I do. So one of the really weird things about forestry is that it's like, there's all different kinds of ways that we do forestry, and different foresters would define their jobs in like completely different ways. So like if you're an industrial production forester from the West Coast and all you do is clear cut, you think that your job is to harvest wood as efficiently as possible. And when I think about that, I'm like, that has nothing to do with what my job's about. My job is about managing forests, these complex systems, at times using the cutting of trees as a tool. And my tool is not, solely to like get that wood out of there. My tool is to produce some resources while at the same time promoting complex, resilient forests, which are habitat for thousands of different native organisms. So I think about it as managing forests like they manage themselves, where instead of saying, I want forests to be like this because it's more efficient or whatever, I'm saying, how do forests work? Let's study old forests. Let's look at the processes that move them and change them, how they develop over time, and let's manage them that way. And let's also manage them as complex systems, not just limited to trees. And as we do that, let's recognize the importance of all the organisms and all the processes that make forests work, not just the trees. And so how do we do that? In an individual forest, I know I just have about 5 minutes left. In an individual forest, we do it by letting trees get older. That's what's called increasing rotation length. We do it by, in the course of forest management, we don't cut every tree because it gets big. We cut big trees sometimes, but we also leave big legacy trees. So these are trees whose job it is to just be big trees in the woods and to store carbon and to provide the many habitat benefits of big trees in the woods, and eventually to become big dead trees. And if you tell this to a logger, it'll absolutely blow their mind, but it is part of how we keep forests healthy and how we grow trees in the future. We manage for mostly multi-generational forests. Forests, as they grow and develop over time, become more complex. And what that means is different sizes and ages and species of trees, different generations of trees, this very sort of complex, messy looking appearance. But that's not necessarily totally the case. Every developmental stage of forest is really important. But in general, the type of forest that we are lacking across our landscape the most is these sort of complex, older forest type structure. Leave lots of dead wood. Dead wood's not a mess. It's not a waste. It's providing, again, complex habitat opportunities for microorganisms, for fungi, for everything from bear to the tiny little critters that turn wood into soil, and that soil that provides the substrate for trees to grow in. We try to increase the resilience and adaptability at every step by increasing, again, diversity, complexity. We address forest health threats like invasive plants. Sometimes that requires us to do crazy stuff that we never thought we'd do, like use herbicide on invasive plants, but it's worth it to protect biodiversity when there's no other way to do that. Deer overpopulation. Sometimes you got to kill deer because we are now the native predator of deer, and we don't have wolves and catamounts on our landscape anymore. And deer are this massive biodiversity threat that if you want to see how bad it gets, you can just go south. We can also, through this type of management, we can create structures which are very similar to, again, old forests, or what are sometimes called old growth forests. These different species that are listed here, salamanders, mosses, lichens, and other bryophytes, bark foraging birds, bird species diversity in general, and fungi. These are all indicators of old forests. And in the process of ecological forest management, we can provide for all these things by providing big trees, by providing complex structure, making the forest really messy and weird with different canopy gaps and shapes and sizes and species of trees, dead wood, all that stuff. We can provide and have all those things in the forest following forest management and provide a lot of those same attributes. The most important thing we can do in managing for forest carbon across the landscape is keeping forests as forests. Avoiding deforestation, fragmentation, and parcelization. And there's no better way to do this than by conservation, permanent protection of forests, but also planning and zoning is really important. So like in our communities, people are making profound decisions about the way that we are taking care of our forests that are gonna persist forever. And the way, you know, where people put a house or a driveway, the way that we subdivide a block of forested land is in most ways far more of a threat than, you know, like a really bad logging job, because that's permanent. And that block of forest land will never be the same. And so this is, you know, even if we do nothing else, protecting forests as forests and as big forest, unfragmented forest blocks is the most important thing you can do. And if you're listening to this, there is probably an opening on your town's planning commission, and you can join it and you can change the way that the forests in your community are protected. Managing for ecologically functional landscapes. I know I just have like one more minute. We also need to think about how our landscapes are connected and managed for all different appropriate habitat types. So in some cases, we may need to manage, we need to, in general, to manage young, simple forests to be more resilient, diverse, complex, more like old forests. But we also need to create pockets of habitat that are underrepresented across the landscape. So this may include creating these bigger openings to create young forest, which we know to be a habitat type, which is underrepresented across our landscape, which is utilized by many of our native species, including bird species that are in decline. And that is an awful way to manage for forest carbon, but is important in sort of a more holistic sense. And we need to address these landscape level threats, the biggest of which is forest conversion and fragmentation. And the last thing I'll say, again, this idea of managing forests for a better world. Tony D'Amato, who wrote a couple of the papers that Tim and I have referenced, he says that forests are a socio-ecological system. And so what that means is that the humans and the forests are intertwined, and we pretending that they're not is a recipe for just not understanding how interrelated we really are. So there's this crazy, weird feeling, scary stuff like logging, right? Where we're cutting trees, and we love trees. Why would we want to do that, right? But a major way that we make an impact on the world is how we consume resources. And the choice isn't if you want to impact ecosystems, it's what do you want that impact to be? If it's not in front of you, it's somewhere else. It's impacting peoples and ecosystems somewhere. And, you know, when we do something like say, we don't want to see logging in our community, or we don't want to see agriculture in our community, something like that, these local renewable resources, but we're still consuming resources. The danger is that we'll be consuming resources that are just affecting someone who doesn't have the luxury of saying, not in my backyard, right? And potentially that there'll be non-local, non-renewable resources, which we wouldn't be comfortable having the impacts of that, the production and the processing of those resources in our communities. And if we're not comfortable with that, we probably shouldn't be consuming those resources. The last thing I'll say is that we also know that the impacts of our resource consumption doesn't affect all people equally. So climate justice, environmental racism, these are real things in our world, and there are some confusing choices to make. And you know, one of the craziest things is looking at, you know, something like this skidder here, pulling these trees out and saying, you know, in what way is this helping to build a more just world, a more equitable world, a more climate resilient world? Forests are complicated. And I'll just say that, and hopefully we can get into some more of the specifics in the questions. These are some of the resources I've cited. That forest carbon piece that Tim mentioned, Also, this cool piece, also by Tony D'Amato and Paul Catanzaro, called Restoring Old Growth Characteristics. And this other piece, also by Tony D'Amato and Paul Catanzaro, and also Emily Silver Huff, called Increasing Forest Resiliency for an Uncertain Future. All right, that was a whirlwind, gang.
Really was great. Thanks so much, Ethan and Tim. We have started to get a few questions in, so folks, for the most part, we'll be looking at what's in the chat. But I saw that George Plum had his hand up a while ago. So George, why don't you get the first question in?
I'm just going to say that my forest management plan was done in 2015 and doesn't address this issue at all. Should my forest management plan be updated and revised to address the carbon sequestration issue?
Good question. Tim,
I
Ethan?
mean, yeah, I would say, George, that it certainly could. You know, there are practices that are, in ways of managing forests that are carbon positive that may not be explicitly called carbon positive, in your plan. So, stuff like, dealing with invasive species, for instance, is a carbon benefit, and it's also a benefit to wildlife habitat and all this other stuff. So even if the name of carbon, the name carbon wasn't necessarily like invoked in your forest management plan, it doesn't mean that it's by any means like an anti-carbon or anti-climate resilience forest management plan. But, one thing that you can do, George, if you're in Vermont, if you're in the current use, you can submit a forest management plan amendment to your county forester. I receive these all the time. You don't have to necessarily redo your whole plan, but you could, tweak what you're trying to do over the next 10 years, or, add more information specifically about forest carbon in that amendment. So that could be a good way to do it. Or speak to your consulting forester. It might be that they are thinking about forest carbon and they're thinking about climate resilience and adaptability, but they just didn't necessarily call it out in your plan.
I don't have a whole lot to add to what Ethan said, but when I redid our plan 2 years ago, I had our consulting forester put in a chapter in our plan on climate change and specifically on carbon. And the intent was to populate those sections over time. So as Ethan was suggesting with amendments, if we were to update that chapter, submit that as an amendment. And so I have to admit that I haven't updated that yet, but that's an intent as we look at understand forest carbon in Vermont better, and the impacts of climate change, then I'll be in a better position to populate those chapters.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. I'll begin to work on it.
Great. I guess as I scroll down the chat, I'll note that Zach left a note there adding reference to the Northeast Wilderness Trust on the Burnt Mountain project. Thanks, Zach, for pointing that out. Knox Common may not be, I don't know if that person is still on the call, but asked the question I have certainly heard often in relation to forest carbon and forest management. How does that relate to the current use value program?
Yeah, I can answer that because the county foresters administer the current use program in our respective counties. The answer is that the type of management that I'm describing, so doing stuff like, managing for a more complex forest and leaving legacy trees forever and leaving tons of dead wood on the ground and managing for species diversity and for structural diversity, for complexity in our ecosystems and for biodiversity, all of these things are completely compatible with the current use program. So the one thing that's not compatible right now with the current use program is you can't just never say that you're never going to manage your forest ever under any circumstances. You're never going to cut a tree. So that's not compatible with the program as it currently exists. But that said, there could be large intervals of time between when it's appropriate to treat your land. You don't have to be out there, cutting down trees all the time. You certainly don't have to be cutting down all the trees. You don't have to cut down all the trees whenever they get big. It's really open to interpretation, as far as you can manage your land in a lot of different ways. You just can't right now just say, I'm never going to manage my land at all, ever, under any circumstances.
Great, thanks. And Dennis Rajeski. Dennis, do you want to ask your question? You're still with us. Hi, Dennis. Welcome.
Hi. Hey, thanks, by the way. Excellent presentations. And my question is pretty simple. I dare say I like the idea of forest plans. We have a couple of 100 acres and we've been doing stuff with it, hopefully in line with what you guys have been talking about. And one question is, when we aren't here anymore, it would be nice if somebody didn't build a Walmart on that property. And what's a good idea for an easement that will keep the things going? Thanks again.
What do you think, Tim?
So we have, I think, a key there for the long term. Certainly conservation easements can protect your land for the long term, but also having one thing we're looking at right now is succession planning, and putting a succession plan in place so that we have more control over what happens with that land long term. And it's a laborious process, and I imagine Ethan has been through many of these, but you still have hair, Ethan, which is a good sign. But I think both the easements and the conservation or the succession plan maybe items you want to pursue.
Yeah, I think it's important to call out so a lot of us think about the concept of conservation. So we call this little c, like lowercase c conservation, is you're managing the land, you're not developing it, you're taking care of it, right? You're the steward of this piece of forest land. Uppercase C conservation is what Tim mentioned, a conservation easement. And that is a permanent protection on the land where you're essentially taking your development rights and you're taking, certain other rights of yours, and you're giving them to someone else. You're giving them to a land trust usually, who will retain them in perpetuity. And so a lot of times those easements are donated. Sometimes they're purchased in the case of specific, really important properties. The Vermont Land Trust or somebody will find a way to get funding and to buy those rights from you. But it's really important. I'm actually in the process of conserving my land, permanently protecting my land forever right now with the Richmond Land Trust. And for me, it was just like, who knows what the future is going to hold, but this piece of land is too important to me. And I just need to know that it's always going to be forest. It's always going to be like this. I joke that, who knows, maybe my heirs will be like real jerks, and they'll hate forests and they just want to build condos. And so that's a big step. And I think it's beautiful. It feels incredible. And it's, it's a lot of that is really important to protecting the forest and our landscape. And then succession planning. So there are all these different structures you can put your land in, clever different ways of making sure that as it passes from landowner to landowner or from generation to generation, that it's protected. And that, all the care and time you've put into that land over your lifetime isn't, it doesn't become a Walmart or something like that. So I know that Vermont Woodlands Association in particular, and Vermont Coverts, which is another organization that Tim mentioned, they have both been active in helping landowners develop forest succession plans. And Vermont Woodlands Association even had a grant, and they had a person who would help you develop that plan. So I would really recommend signing up for the mailing list or the newsletter of Vermont Coverts and or Vermont Woodlands Association, and you'll get more information about that stuff.
They've been at it for a long time, the Vermont Coverts.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, great. We have a question from David Ritchie. Is that correct? And about silvopasture?
Yes. Thank you very much. This is great. I guess I've been learning a little bit over the past 10 or 12 years that you can put livestock back into forests and do it in a way that's not too hard on the root systems, because you move the animals quite readily. And I just wonder if you have any comments about what the effects are and what the gains and losses you've seen are from it.
Yeah, yeah, it's certainly not something that I would recommend. It's actually in the current use program, it's not something we allow, because the problem is with livestock in the woods that they're browsing the understory, they're browsing the plants and the trees that we want to be our future forest, and which are themselves really important habitats and that are building soils and all that stuff. So yeah, it's not something we allow. I would always recommend people to not do that. A different version of that, that I'm hearing more about, but I haven't seen successfully implemented, is silvopasture, in the sense of like people growing trees for timber or fruit and nut trees and having pasturing around those areas.
Yeah.
I know a lot less about that. But yeah, I definitely, livestock in the woods I haven't seen an example of it not be pretty destructive, for just not in terms of just, again, not just thinking about the trees, but like the whole system, right? Like the habitats that are also associated with that forest. Tim, do you try to silvopasture over there?
No, I haven't gone that route yet.
One of the things that's interesting, like with a lot of these different things, and this is true for like permaculture too, is that it's just really important that we understand what we're doing. So like with, for instance, with producing wood, there are a lot of parts of the world where they don't have like a lot of forest management in natural forests like we do. So they'll have either old forests that are completely unmanaged, or areas that are like super, super intensively managed, like we have in the American Southeast or the American Northwest or whatever, or, up in Maine, New Brunswick. So, they allow some forests to just be old growth forests, but then the trade-off is to get wood, they have to like just beat the hell out of these other forests. And so it's okay. Like, and I think, to a certain extent, that's part of our solution. That's part of how we have old forests on our landscape and we still have wood, is that we also have intensively managed forests. But we need to understand when we do that, what those forests are. So those forests are not going to become complex, diverse old forests that have this wide range of like ecological processes that are associated with them. They're going to be, they're going to be young forest, and then they're going to get cut down, and then they're going to be young forest, and then they're going to get cut down. And so we can't expect them to provide this whole wide range of habitats. They would need to occur in balance with forests that are unmanaged and forests that are managed lightly, and ecologically managed. And so like the idea of growing trees for timber, in a field, which they're also being grazed around, I think that's great, but we also need to understand that that's not a forest, right? That's us growing wood. In the same way that if we create like with permaculture, we can't, nor should we want to, replace forests with like food forests, right? Food forest is a much better way to grow food than a lot of the ways that we currently grow food, but that doesn't necessarily replace forests, which are these like incredibly, again, complex dynamic systems which have intrinsic value and don't just exist, to give us stuff. And that also the goods and services that are produced by native forests are massively benefiting us all the time, including our ability to grow food in agricultural environments.
Clean air, clean water, etc.
That's right. Yeah, and even like stuff like pollinator habitat, like almost all of our pollinators, 2/3 of Vermont's plants require animal pollination of some kind. Almost all of those animals, they visit those beautiful wildflower meadows, but they live in the woods. They live in leaf litter, they live in rotting wood, they live in trees. So that's just really important to remember.
Interesting. Zach, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Ethan and Tim, I appreciate your presentations. And you may know me already. I don't know. I haven't had a chance to meet you, Ethan, in person, but I'm Zach Porter, and I'm the Lake Champlain Lake Keeper at Conservation Law Foundation, and very closely involved in a variety of things that touch on the topics that you've discussed tonight. And Vermont is lucky to have you sharing, Ethan and Tim, your insights with forest landowners. I certainly hope that more of Vermont's actively managed forests go the way of ecological forestry. So, I really do believe that, what you're preaching here is something that I hope that, more, landowners who are committed to managing in that way shift to. I think one thing that I'm curious to have you speak about is the value of wild forests. Right now, just about 3% of Vermont is managed in a, kind of strict nature preserve, kind of category, whether that's a place like Burnt Mountain that has a forever wild easement on it, or whether that's a state natural area or wilderness area. And what we know is that we need more ecological forestry in forests that are actively managed, but we also need more wild forests. And I think that both are, very apparent from the science that is coming out right now. And Vermont is way behind on the wild forest front, way behind our neighbors across the lake in New York. And so I am just curious if you might speak to this. And one thing I will just add in before handing over the mic again is just, you mentioned, somebody asked a great question about use value appraisal. And just so everybody here knows, there is an effort afoot right now to amend the use value appraisal program so that there would be a wildlands or reserve category available to landowners. And also to allow landowners to put a forever wild easement on their property and still be enrolled in use value appraisal, which is currently not an option. So there's a bias in the system right now, so that a landowner who wants to benefit from these same tax breaks and is still providing all of these goods and services that benefit all of Vermont by having that forest stay forest, that's not possible today. So I hope that this change will move forward. I think the climate action plan is a great way potentially to propose that change. And I'm hopeful that the people on this call might consider actually making a comment to that effect for the climate action plan, which is in development right now. And I'm sure Steve and Rob can share more details about that, and probably already have on past presentations. But Ethan and Tim, I'm just curious, to you, what's the role of wildlands, and how do we get to that, VCD, Vermont Conservation Design target of 10%, old forest, 9% old forests in the state of Vermont?
Yeah, I mean, I don't totally know how we get there. I think that, but I mean, I think it's, it's unquestioned. There's this sort of like funny thing where it's like people who believe that all forests exist only to be managed, right? They're like a commodity. Their sole, what they're there for is to be exploited. And then on the other side is people who believe that all forest management is fundamentally wrong and should never, the tree should never be cut. And those two groups are like, they just like bashing the heck out of each other, and like they like galvanize each other, and they like scare the heck out of each other. And and in reality, I believe in forest management. I love it. I think it can be done in like this really profound and regenerative and beautiful way. And I love the idea of forests not being managed, and those two ideas in my mind, as are completely compatible. And so the question is like, how do we honor both of those things at once? Because again, recognizing that old forests are providing something unique to our landscape, that we can approximate and we can simulate with ecological forest management, but it will never be exactly the same. And so, in a lot of the town forests that I manage, we're both doing active management. This is true for like the Heinsberg Town Forest and the Andrews Community Forest in Richmond. We have both active management that's occurring that we're excited about, and then we think is like really innovative and compelling. And on the same forest, we have significant areas of reserve that will never be managed. And I think that like highlighting that contrast is so important, because just sort of having this like more holistic approach to the way we think about our relationship with our forest, where we're like, yeah, you know, we recognize that local renewable resources are important and that we need to be providing more of them, and that all forest management is not clear cutting, you know, like we can do it in these ways that are qualitatively better. And, you know, that like forests, you know, don't like need to be managed on every single acre of the world. You know, I think that is so important to just in general, again, like what I think about is managing forests for a better world, building a relationship with our world, which is more functional. Tim, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was gonna say, Zach, that I think another piece of it is as we all learn more about the benefits of forests for climate. And yeah, we've known about that for a while, but there's much more research that has been done in the last 5 years, for example. I think that's going to be a catalyst for there to be more innovative thinking about how ways to preserve our forests and in what form they should be preserved in. So I think from my work over the last 4 years, it's very encouraging to see how people are looking. There's much more discussion and dialogue about what we can do to all the different strategies we can deploy to preserve our forests. And I think to your point, Jack, we're fortunate to have the Nature Conservancy and the Conservation Law Foundation and lots of other organizations in UVM, the professors at UVM and the researchers there. We've got a tremendous amount of resources we can tap into. So I'm encouraged by all that's going on.
Another resource that's out there, Fritz Schmidt raises a question about town forests, and you know, what do you think the potential is for using those town forests for letting people know about this or practicing an ecological model?
Oh yeah, I think it's hugely important. Yeah, and I think I'd invite you all to check out some of the work that I do at these town forests, because I really go over the top to try and just get people out there to just, you know, look at it, because hand in hand with understanding forest management is understanding forests, right? And so we have all these misunderstandings about forests based on all this different stuff, like forests are supposed to be neat and tidy and forests never change, and, you know, all this other stuff, which is not true. That's not how forests work. And if you go into old growth forests, you'll see that that's not what they're like, that they're these incredibly like dynamic environments that are like I say, celebrating death and change. And so helping people understand that, and then sort of moving to a place from there of understanding how forest management can be done in that context. And so forest management to most people looks bad no matter what. Like, it just looks messy, the forest looks different, people are like, I don't like this, but they've never had someone like me necessarily telling them, you know, that I think it can be regenerative, and that I think it can make forests more complex, and that I think it can be used to promote biodiversity and climate resiliency and all this stuff. So I have at the Heinsberg Town Forest, I have a link tree that I can put in to the chat, where you can look at a whole bunch of different stuff that I do. I have a mailing list about it. I have a YouTube channel. I put out regular like 5-minute videos where I talk about, you know, what we're doing and why we're doing it, and just general stuff about forests. You can also find the recordings of all the 60 or so webinars that I've done over the last year on there, if you want to watch some longer type videos. I've made ArcGIS story maps about it. I write a monthly column, and I have a column in Northern Woodlands magazine. There's a lot of different ways to learn about this stuff, and town forests, I really like using them as a place to demonstrate this kind of work. I think it's really important. So yeah, that's my link tree right there.
Oh,
and you
great.
can sign up for all that stuff. Check out pretty much everything right there.
Great, thanks so much. Ethan, you've had, there's been quite a few questions in your direction. Tim, I want to make sure that if you have anything else to add to this today, that we're about to wrap up. I wonder if you have any last things to share.
Yeah, just to that last point, Steve, there's a effort within the legislature to look at forest carbon in state on state land. So I think the first place they're going to be looking at is Calvin Coolidge State Forest West, and looking at what the opportunities are with forest carbon. So that's a big step. I believe the state wasn't all that enthusiastic about it initially, but things have turned. We have, as a reminder to most people, we have our Vermont climate forester, Ali Kasiba, who is absolutely tremendous, a great resource in the state, and she's been driving a lot of this. But it would be exciting to see us pursue state lands. And I don't know, Ethan, whether you have any update on that, but that's the latest I've heard.
No, I think we're on the same page about that one.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, it just reminded me that I also am the county forester for Chittenden County, right, which is like contains a quarter of the people in the state, and we're losing. I'm not sure about this, but it feels like we're losing forest land faster than anybody else. That more important than, and this pains me because I'm really invested in the intricacies and the nuances of like doing forest management in a really good way. More important than reforming the way we do forest management is keeping forests as forests. That is, if we can't prevent forests from being turned into other stuff, all that other stuff doesn't matter. And even a badly managed forest is 1,000 times better than a parking lot. And will sequester and store carbon, no matter what, forever.
Well, thanks, Ethan. Thanks, Tim, both of you. It's been a great presentation. I can pass it over to Rob now he's got a closing slide. And thanks everybody for joining us tonight. Great discussion. Glad you could all be with us. Rob.
Yes, thank you all for participating in tonight's conversation. For those who've been participating in a lot of our conversations, we've been doing these almost regularly since the start of the pandemic. We were calling it almost regularly on Wednesdays. And next Wednesday, we're doing a discussion around transportation issues in the Climate Action Plan. And that's going to be with Joey Miller, the Vermont Natural Resources Council, and Gina Campoli, the former Senior Policy Manager for the Agency of Transportation under Peter Shumlin. Then also on September 29th, we're going to be doing a conversation about the Megadam hydropower. This one's going to be with our fellow Sierra Club chapters throughout the region. It's actually being organized by the main chapter, but we agreed to be a part of it. So our conversation that evening is going to be on the not till 8 p.m. and it's about carbon accountability. And Steve Crowley is going to be participating heavily in that one. But then also we're allowed to do in-person events again. So the Sierra Club is going to be doing two big National Drive Electric Week events to promote vehicle electrification. So if you're in South Burlington, the Sun Carnival, we're sponsoring with Sun Common and the Drive Electric Vermont. We have about 30 something electric vehicles registered. It's going to be at the old Hannaford's parking lot on Route 7 there. There'll be free ice cream and music by Dave Keller. So he's playing electric guitar, by the way. Obviously, Drive Electric. He's better to play electric too. And then October 2nd, we're also going to be doing one at Montpelier State House. We're just calling it a Drive Electric Week State House meetup. So hopefully those who want to show their electric vehicles can show up there. And it's timed right around by the farmers market. So come to Montpelier, go to the great farmers market, and it's just around the corner from each other. So those are our events. And if you go to our website, sierraclub.org, Vermont, you can see all our upcoming events. and all these recordings from this and all of our past ones. So this will be posted up hopefully tomorrow. If not, I'll have it up by Monday, and I'll share everybody the link coming up in the next coming weeks. Within the next week. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for our presenters, Tim and Ethan, and Steve and Suzanne for helping lead these conversations with us. So thank you all, and good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Have a good night.
Good night.